University of California, Berkeley, who's going to be giving a research presentation today on God, sex, and especially politics, disentangling the dimensions of discrimination. I've asked Stephen, with a workshop in mind, he's circulated a paper, and I've asked him to give a talk about half an hour long. If you have questions, it's one of the nice features of Zoom is that you can chat the question in our chat feature as they come to you. Other people can react to that question in real time, and then those chat questions can then serve as the beginning of our conversation at the end of the talk, when we will open it up to a question and answer session. Although this talk is threatening to go for an hour and a half, these lunchtime talks are typically scheduled for an hour. So we will have that wiggle room. But Professor Gaga, would you get us started?
Sure. Thanks so much, Graham. Thanks for having me. So the irony of this talk is that it grows out of a literature on what creates social distance, right? And separates us and the choices we make to associate with people who we might meet or not. And in fact, right, part of the kind of the story of this talk is thinking about when we meet people, the choices we make to interact with them or not. And in fact, you know, there are many places where we might meet people in kind of our neighborhoods and in other social settings, where when we have to make the explicit choice about making judgments of them and whether we want to continue conversations with them and do more. And in fact, right, there are many explicit symbols that we may not that may be a bit more overt than we have not seen in the past when interacting with others in our neighborhood, like explicit signs of one's kind of own partisanship and other things. And including, right, these dueling duplexes of Biden and Trump signs in Dallas. But in fact, right, these overt signs create a symbol and create a sign to a lot of people that they may or may not want to interact with others. And partisanship in particular, and a number of authors have noted it, right, is increasingly salient in society when we're interacting with other people, even in relatively apolitical settings. And so kind of the driving question here is how much does it affect the choices we make to kind of interact and socialize with other individuals, and how can it kind of create these separations in society? And over time, right, we've seen a rise in what's called affective polarization. And in particular, notably, this is from the American National Election Study and just the feeling thermometers for one's own party, as well as the other party here. And what's quite striking is that the in-group kind of attitudes, right, are relatively stable. They do bounce around and maybe have declined slightly in terms of whether one likes someone of their own party. But in fact, the attitudes toward the out-group or the warmth toward the out-group has declined quite a bit from about, you know, half several decades ago down now to nearly a quarter. And it's not just, right, kind of just the feeling thermometer on the American National Election Study. Right. So in 1958, Gallup asked this question about if you had a daughter of marriageable age, would you prefer she'd marry a Democrat or Republican? And we see maybe a quarter or a third of Democrats and Republicans wanting the same. And if you ask the same question in 2016, Lynn Vavreck wrote up a piece here, right, where she asked the same question and also kind of took the gendered language out and son or daughter. And we see, right, a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans, right, want someone from their kind of own party. And so I briefly just want to talk about partisanship and social distance and a few of the works there. Talk about kind of the core of this study, which is using a conjoint experiment to try to separate out, right, to disentangle these various dimensions on which we judge others. And talk about the attributes that kind of lead to these judgments. But also talk about the affinities then. When you share traits with these individuals, how does that change your willingness to interact with them? So when we judge others, right, when we meet new people, right, in our neighborhood or at our farmer's market, right, there's lots of information that shapes how we think about them, both kind of filling in the gaps in knowledge from stereotypes that we do hold, based on, you know, race, gender, and every other kind of identity we might imagine. But they're also individuating information, things that individualizes the person and we might think is unique. And we also know, right, of course, that there are identities that may be shared or unshared with these. And there are reasons to believe why it may not necessarily always create out-group hostility. It can. But in line with this, we also have a lot of identities, right? There's not just one summary way of thinking about ourselves or others. And that over time and the context, right, this may create a dependence. Kind of the identity that's salient might depend on kind of whatever's happening here. So the big question, right, is how do these identities create social distance and our choices to interact with others? And we're focusing here primarily, although we're going to present results, right? The talk is titled kind of God, Sex, and Politics. We're going to talk about these other dimensions as well. But many have recently argued, right, that partisan discrimination, the choices we make, right, to discriminate depending on our kind of our social ties, is important. And one of the difficulties in studying it, and kind of one of the reasons it's so powerful, is it's increasingly sorted and related to many other identities that we hold. And a number of pieces of work, right, in the past decade or so have shown, right, that partisanship has bled over to kind of routine judgments we make about who we socialize with and the choices we make. A couple sampling of studies here, right? So you can see this in a resume experiment, right? An effect of partisanship in judging someone and whether they're kind of president of the Young Democrats or president of the Young Republicans, alongside a lot of other information. We also know that in kind of online dating behaviors on OkCupid and other platforms, that there's evidence of kind of partisan homophily in kind of dating. And there are two big questions that I want to focus on kind of growing out of this literature, is that we can show that partisanship has mattered, and many authors have done so, but how big is a big effect, right? How relative to other identities and relative to other things in which we make judgments about people, how much does this matter? And when holding the other things constant. And a big issue, particularly in line with kind of the work kind of showing kind of this convergence of identities from Liliana Mason and others, right, is are people just using politics to infer other things about whether the personality or other things about this person that may make them more desirable or less desirable to interact with. So I'm going to present data from an experiment that was fielded a few years back in December 2017. And so a natural question, kind of this paper exists as a paper, right? And we're considering extending it in kind of future work. Partly because a big question many people always ask is, it's a few years back, right? Is it different now than it was then, right? And was then different than it was maybe a number of years prior? And we're going to present people with a choice between two people. And the survey simply says, right on the next few screens, we're going to show you pairs of people who have taken surveys in the past. This is a cover story, right, where these people are kind of randomly created and their attributes here. But the goal here is that people are thinking about just other random survey takers like themselves, right? Not politicians, not just kind of just other random people that are out there. And there are 5 separate tasks. I'll show you the wording on the next slide, but asking whether you want someone to kind of join your family by marriage, be a neighbor, offer a loan to this person, right, give to a charity of theirs, or serve on a jury with them. And each respondent will make all 5, right, will make 5 choices between 2 individuals, all in the same task, just to keep things consistent. And we're going to randomize 10 different factors, right? So race, sex, age, party, ideology, kind of a little bit to kind of round out kind of an idea of geographic polarization, like where someone grew up, religion, their career, their marital status, and their sexual orientation. And importantly, kind of different from other conjoint studies, all the effects I'll present are relative to a not asked category. That is, because these are survey takers or ostensibly survey takers in previous surveys, kind of the cover stories, we just don't know this information. So kind of leaving out the absence of this information is what we can do these effects relative to kind of see how people might make different inferences. And then, of course, I'll present something at the very end. Is at the very end, we ask them kind of what was most important in your decision making, just to get a very explicit thing here, right? Are people really willing to say that, yeah, no, I dislike or like that person because of their politics? So the choice tasks, there are 5. So the first 2, the relative and the neighbor, are relatively common in the social distance literature and have been used kind of explicitly in a number of different ways to get something, kind of a measure of kind of social and personal closeness. But part of the goal of this was to get some that are maybe a bit more ostensibly political, or kind of obviously have personal interactions, but where you might want to, or people might make the choice to discriminate based on kind of some kind of personal animus, right, or like for someone. And then finally, the last one, right, is I was sitting in jury duty down in San Diego and decided, right? This is a place where it kind of mixes both personal and political, is you've got to interact with these people for maybe several weeks, but also, right, the choices they make might affect kind of, right, someone's life politically. And so the idea here, right, is this is just kind of a rough sketch that's not based empirically at all, right, is a lot of the previous social distance literature is in tasks up here. And that if we can think about things where they might have some political consequence and vary a bit in terms of how much personal interaction you might have, we might see some differences. So I'll just want to kind of lay out all the various factor levels too. So for race, we kind of Black or African American, white, Hispanic or Latino or Asian American. We have female and male respondents. We randomized age continuously, just so the same age didn't keep popping up. We started it at 25 just because some of these careers, right, you can't be 18 and have that particular career. So just to make a kind of weed out some implausible combinations. We've got marital status, we've got sexual orientation, we've got kind of the common Pew religious categories, got a little context about where someone grew up. We've got a variety of careers here. And we've got party, as mentioned, and we've got 4 levels of ideology. So whether someone's fiscally liberal, socially liberal, fiscally conservative, or socially conservative, to think about people that might be slightly at odds with their party ideologically and whether that affects or can erase some of that. So just to provide kind of an image of what it is, right? So you do this 5 times and it would be shown in a table like this. The rows of the table would be randomized at the level of the respondent, but then kept constant for that respondent, just so the whole table doesn't get jumbled every time they have to do it. But this one just happened to be parties on top, but it's not always, right, the most kind of central one at the very beginning. So there are a number of advantages and disadvantages I just want to briefly dive into before I show kind of results. The first is that you can end up with weird combinations of people because this is fully randomized. Part of this is a virtue of the design because in equilibrium, right, we know many of these attributes are correlated with one another. And so it's often hard to separate the effect of one versus another. And here we are because we're breaking that with randomization. But there can be some weird, right, there's going to over roughly 25,000 different profiles that are displayed. Some of them look weird, right, and kind of don't go with what we typically think. There are, we have to assume weak interactions. We can test this for some that might be particularly interesting that we think. And recent kind of more technical work has noted that if you're using kind of average marginal component effects in a conjoint experiment to try to figure out kind of vote or majority kind of preference, this is affected by intensity. So if a lot of people really, really like some attribute or whatever, right, it doesn't necessarily mean the majority of people that in this survey, right, are actually responding in a way to create a positive coefficient. It could just be some people have a lot of intensity for that. But there's a lot of advantages too, right? We get the relative effects of all of these factors. We introduce this kind of not asked category, so whatever people assume in the background. We tried to balance trade-offs between kind of satisficing, where if someone's presented with a million bits of information about someone, right, they'll pick the easiest, maybe it's party and not ignore the rest, versus masking, right? Whereas if I presented you a conjoint with one row, it was like, do you want a Democrat or Republican, right? That's kind of masking all the variation underneath it. And arguably, right, it should reduce some social desirability effects here, because if you want to discriminate on something you arguably kind of know you shouldn't, or that would look bad if you did, you've got cover because there's a lot of other bits of information here. And this survey, while kind of fielded by political scientists, right, wasn't explicitly political, that it was not kind of primed or introduced as a survey about politics. So what happened? Well, the first core finding, as I spent some time talking about these different tasks, is that it really doesn't matter. You can test this a whole bunch of different ways. I'm going to pool across all 5 of those tasks. So the relative, the neighbor, the jury, the lone, is that people are very willing to judge others, right? But the context doesn't matter much. And so one worry we had is, well, maybe people just aren't reading the choice or reading the thing in the survey and ignoring it. But the one thing we do find is that for the lone task, career matters an absolute ton because of kind of perceptions of deservingness and other things. So we have some evidence people are reading this stuff, but for many of the stuff, it's do you like this person or not? So for all the results I'm going to present, basically are in tables, or sorry, graphics like this, where on the x-axis here, we've got the change in the probability that you would pick a particular person. And so this would be, right, a 10% increase, a 20%. And here we've got it by respondent partisanship with leaners included. And this isn't a full overall model with all of these factor levels kind of within it. I'm just going to broke it apart to multiple slides so we can see it. We've got 95% confidence intervals on each one of the estimates, and it's all relative to the not asked. So for the religious categories, right, a few things are striking right away, right, is that kind of unsurprisingly given rhetoric, right, Republicans don't particularly respond positively to Muslim targets, right, or people as described. Also, they don't respond kind of a little less so positively towards atheists. And relatedly, right, on the other side, we see Democrats respond more negatively to evangelical Protestants. And then the rest, right, are clustered pretty closely to zero. We don't see that much divergence. Interestingly, for the racial categories, right, we also don't see a lot of movement here. We see Democratic respondents slightly more favorable to Black or African Americans. Part of that is due to kind of the disproportionate share, right, of Democrats who are Black or African American, and we'll kind of unpack that in a couple future slides. If we look at some other important factors, when we look at sexual orientation, we see, right, basically no difference relative to not asked for Democrats in terms of their positivity towards these, although a negative kind of effect for LGBT targets among Republicans and a positive effect for those described as heterosexual among Republicans. And regarding sex, right, we see relatively even kind of effects among Republicans, but then a positive preference for female targets among Democrats. And finally, kind of the point and kind of what I centered this talk around is if we look at partisanship and ideology, we see an interesting and kind of very, kind of expected story. That is, when a target is described as Republicans, Democrats are very unwilling to kind of like this person. Republicans, right, much more so, kind of the in-group positivity is about even here. Although notably, and this actually diverges a bit from some previous work on the topic, we see kind of Democrats being more negative about Republicans and Republicans being negative about Democrats here in terms of their willingness to interact with them. And with the kind of socially liberal, fiscally liberal, and the other kind of ideological categories, we see arguably what you'd expect, although notably kind of the least negative among Democrats. Here among the kind of kind of ideology things is that if someone's fiscally conservative, it's not necessarily a hit against them. So a natural question would be then, right, is, well, kind of what's doing the work here? Because it's not just partisanship, that these identities that people have, but a lot of other factors. And so we can look at, oh, I forgot to put this in, right? These are all the other categories. It's really noisy, right? But just to show you some of the other things, unsurprisingly, right? People don't like lobbyists, people like teachers and small business owners. There's very little variation across age, kind of no matter how we cut it. And not a ton going on in terms of kind of marital status and where someone grew up as well. And we can come back to these if we want to talk about them a bit later, but there's not a kind of a massive amount of movement here. If we look at affinities, though, we begin to see kind of a more interesting and kind of complicated story. So here is a model where we have whether the survey respondent shares the attribute with the target presented to them. And for the racial categories, right, we see kind of a positive affinity for one zone, with the exception of white survey respondents. With religion, we see a positive affinity for pretty much every category. We have very few Muslim survey respondents in the sample, but the effect is positive and kind of consistent with the others, despite the wide error band. So expectedly, right, we see kind of some positivity towards one's in-group here. And with respect to sex and sexual orientation, we see effectively kind of no shared kind of positivity for other male respondents, right? Among female respondents, kind of a shared kind of positivity. And for both heterosexual and LGBT kind of survey respondents, right, that share this affinity with the target, we see a positivity, right? And most strongly for those that identify as LGBT. And when we get to the political dimension, right, unsurprisingly, massive positivity based on this, if you share the backgrounds, kind of for the parties, right, highest for Democrats, and for independents and Republicans, right, is often independent is not kind of thought of as a strong political identity, right, that's cohesive, but we do see that positivity shared there. And the highest effect here for those that are socially liberal. So Another way to kind of cut this is how much negativity is there. This is based on shared positive background. But that if we look at here, it's a Democrat rating a Republican, a Democrat rating an independent, and so on, right? So it's the first rating the second. We see a Democrat rating a Republican is, right, the most negative, right? A Republican rating a Democrat is less negative. We saw this kind of already, but we don't see too much kind of movement among independents here. And we see, right, kind of a conservative rating socially liberal, right, and conservative rating fiscally liberal is negative. But the most negative kind of ideological distance is a liberal rating, so someone who's socially conservative. So we can do this, right, kind of with the racial groups, right, as well as sex and sexual orientation. And interestingly, right, we see, a lot of the kind of non-significant variation here, but we see that heterosexual respondents rating LGBT is negative, right, as well as LGBT rating heterosexual respondents is actually a negative estimated effect as well. And one of the kind of big kind of final things I want to show is that when we talk about partisanship and discrimination based on partisanship, there's a question of, well, is someone kind of a good partisan? Are people using other bits of information to figure out how well someone meets the mold of some kind of stereotype? And so if we look at, in combination, the ideology and the partisanship information, we can see some interesting kind of interactions. So for Republican respondents only, we've got the Republican target, right, independent target and Democratic target, and the 4 levels of ideology that we presented to them. And what's interesting is that, right, we see kind of these error bounds overlapping 0 for the kind of contradictory settings, such that if you're a Republican rating a Republican, but they're described as fiscally or socially liberal, effectively deletes, right, the positivity you would feel towards that individual because they don't share your kind of ideology. For Democratic respondents, right, as if they actually are express conservative fiscal or social views, right, it deletes that negativity you have. That is, we actually see kind of that counter to party, right, so ideology or express things actually, right, create an environment where then there's no kind of expressed negativity or positivity, where those don't conform to the party stereotype. We see a little bit of a different story for Democrats, however, and in particular, quite a bit more spread out. So Democrats rating Republicans, if they're socially liberal, that effectively kind of negates the negativity. But if they're fiscally liberal, it's not enough, right? And in fact, the most kind of hated group from Democrats are Republicans who are socially conservative. And we see roughly the same kind of pattern go here, whereas if someone is a Democrat rating a Democrat and that Democrat is socially conservative, it kind of erases that positivity one might express, but not fully so for fiscally conservative. So the thing I mentioned kind of at the beginning too is, well, do people know they're doing this, right? So at the end of the survey, we ask what was most important. And overall, right, they had these choices. They had the various factor categories we had, as well as kind of a none were important or none were most important in my decision making. And overall, a lot of people, right, don't want to say that they're discriminating or making choices based on a number of these categories, and select that they are making these choices based on none of the above information, even though this was all the information they had. So it has to be some of it. And career ideology are some of the most common, right? Very few people willing to mention that, right, race or sex or sexual orientation, slightly higher, but was the main driving factor in their choice. And if we look at this across the 5 tasks, I had mentioned we had kind of quite a bit of kind of difference in the loan condition, where a lot of people rely upon career and even willingly admit that they're relying upon the career when making decisions about loans. But otherwise, there's not a ton of kind of super clear kind of story here, is that party bounces around, right? Notably in the loan task, right, people are very unwilling to say that that affects it. Along the others, right, in the kind of mid to high single digits. And for all of these, except for loan as well, right, ideology, right, is kind of one of the largest things that we see people point to in these decisions. So what are some takeaways here, right, is obviously there are always going to be, right, identities, and there's going to be social groupings that create, right, prejudice between individuals, and that partisanship is quite strong, and particularly along religion, along sexual orientation, right, we see are some of the largest effects in this study. But kind of people are very willing to express political prejudice here alongside all of this other information. And in particular, just because we didn't see effects of some of these categories, like race, for example, we didn't see massive effects, doesn't necessarily mean people don't express prejudice, right, based on that or discriminate in their choices. Just when there's all this other information on the table, right, people are using much more of this in their decisions. And with ideology, right, we can see some counter stereotypic attributes, right, can counteract it in places and effectively negate the preference we see expressed for out party individuals. But what's interesting too is that the type of interaction, the type of task doesn't seem to matter that much. It's that people have kind of a pretty strong aversion to people unlike them on many of these factors, and that these matter consistently across them. And obviously, right, there's kind of a big open question for the literature and for everyone, right, is, many people express a lot and write a lot of op-eds and a lot of other things about how we deal with this, right, and how we move forward in a society where people dislike others unlike them. And we can talk about that some if you'd like. So with that, thanks so much for kind of listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Stephen. That was fascinating. I will open it up to questions from the group. You can raise your hand or wave your hand or virtually raise your hand or chat in, however it works for you. I can only see 6 people, so I don't know if virtually waving your hand, do we want to, Stephen, we may want to refer to the slides, so let's keep them open for a second.
Sure.
So if you have a question, please, Stephen, I have a early question just for my own curiosity. And if others know the answer, by all means, what do we know about social desirability in each of these categories? Are Americans reluctant to admit that they discriminate against people of opposite parties the same way that they may be reluctant to say they discriminate against along racial or religious or socioeconomic lines?
So, I mean, there is some reluctance, right, in general, people, right, but it's not nearly as massive, right? The desirability effects for partisanship, for ideology, are nowhere close to what they are for race and gender discrimination, from my knowledge of those literatures.
Cool, thank you. And did you break down, when we looked at the ideology tabs on the self-reported factors that weighted most in your decision, were you able to disaggregate that by treatment, whether they were told they were making a loan to a fiscally conservative versus a socially conservative, fiscally liberal? And do you have enough variability to show us those results or think about them?
So we theoretically could. I don't have that in the slides, but because you saw 5 profiles per, is the probability you're going to get a pretty good mix of the various ideological combinations across those profiles. So I don't, in the self-report, right, is at the respondent level. So we could see about the mix of candidates that were, or the mix of kind of targets that people were presented with, and see how that varied across those. But that's not something I have kind of ready to show, because that is a good point, that someone might, particularly for the loan task, right, use kind of the ideology means quite a bit different whether you're talking about someone who's fiscally liberal or conservative.
Yeah, the loan type, and I see Daniel has a question, so I'll make this a comment. It would be interesting either to add to face validity or just to see the results, to see, like, for jury service, whether people are more likely to want to serve with a socially conservative rather than a socially liberal juror, or right, whether Democrats prefer being with a socially liberal juror. Maybe we can find sort of expected alignments of personal ideology to relative importance per task. And I kept thinking about task dependence when I was thinking about these experiments, and to the extent to which the willingness of people to make these loans or serve on juries could be partially influenced by the task itself. So I have questions about that, but I will save those for later. Professor Thompson, and then Carol.
Yeah, hi, thanks for a really interesting talk. I do want to follow up on Graham's first point. So what you said is that you're able to compare the effect sizes, but I think what Graham was saying is, are people just less likely to be willing to say something? So in the context of your experiment, you might show an effect, but it's not real. Like, I think what he's, I mean, I don't want to put words in Graham's mouth, but I think what he's saying is, how would you actually know if you're measuring the true effect, because you're getting bias in what people are willing, are and are not willing to say. Like, I do think there's some sort of the way that the out party has been, I don't know if I want to say demonized, but it's like the out party is a butt of jokes in a way that's like kind of socially acceptable. And that would affect how people respond to how much they would collaborate with out party members.
Sure. Yeah. So I absolutely think that the role of social desirability in this is a big question, and I think one of the points of this design that when we were kind of putting it forward initially is that because there's enough information, right? There's these multiple different factors about a particular respondent, is that if one wants to discriminate based on things that they know they may be not socially desirable to do so, right, is it can still inflect their judgment in this. And in fact, right, is closer to revealing kind of a truer preference about that than a study in which it's literally kind of the only bit of information there. That is, if it does kind of put a thumb on the scale in one way or another, we might see that many of these attributes that are known to not be socially desirable to discriminate based on have higher magnitudes of effects here. But I completely agree, right, that there is this kind of weirdness in interpretation, is that for partisanship, it's very socially acceptable and even encouraged in many settings to base choices based on this and make fun of the other side. And I think that's part of the reason we see such clear and large effects here, is that people are doing that. And even with all this other information that they could credibly discriminate based on as well, it's still, right, some of the largest effects even with that. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Stephen. I did have my own question too, rather than just rephrasing Graham's question. So I was wondering about like how you see the main, so there's a lot of things that you're covering in this paper, and you have a ton of data, and there's a lot of different directions that you could go in. So I'm wondering, like, do you see the main contribution of this paper as ideology and partisanship being sort of understood and acted upon by voters? Like, I think the ideology stuff that you show about people being able to distinguish between the socially and fiscally is like reflects a pretty like detailed view of which I think most people wouldn't expect. So I think that's surprising and also reflective of like a really complex understanding of ideology that people have. Another contribution, which you alluded to at the beginning, is that previous research would put all of these different tasks into different boxes, and that you show there's not much of a difference. So I think that's another way of going forward, of like showing the fact that there isn't that much difference, more than in the current paper and the way. But I think there are a lot of different ways that you could go. But I think like contrasting it more with other research could be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, thanks for that. That's really useful. As we've moved through iterations of this paper, right, struggled with the framing a bit, because depending on who's reviewing or who we're seeing, we get very different takes on kind of what should be the central focus of the paper. And some of the most interesting to us occasionally we get told to cut it because it's not, particularly the ideology and kind of partisan interaction. The one thing I will kind of mention in response is that we were surprised by how much people queued off ideology as well. And in particular, it withstands both. We don't have a great knowledge measures on this survey for political knowledge or other stuff. But what we do have is, if we kind of dichotomize high and low knowledge individuals, we see roughly the same effects for both, right? Is that we see for partisanship and ideology, it's a weaker effect for those that are lower knowledge and lower in political knowledge, but it's still there.
Can I quick quickly follow up?
Mhm. Sure.
Another sort of a way to help us or framing effect, just following what Danielle said, very short. Did you have a priori expectations as to what factors should have been influential in each of these task conditions? In other words, instead of being agnostic, were there things that you thought a typical American, given broad social values, should have waited, right? Or you would have expected American to wait? You don't have it on your list, but like for jury service, what have you had? Like, I want someone who's fair, or someone who's, contemplative or judicial. Like, if you could have those, then it might even make the unexpected results that you get make more of an impression, even more of an impression, right? There should have been some sort of baseline expectation beyond agnosticism for these results. That's just either derived from the literature that you do with the research on effective polarization in marriage markets or otherwise. Carol, I saw a question of yours Stephen, I didn't mean to cut you off from responding to that.
No.
Yeah, well, actually, I start with I apologize because I'm sure this is in the paper, but I didn't see it. So it's a couple simple questions, like what was the N? How many respondents did you have? Are they national or subnational? And is there any other like age limit or other constraint that you had on the respondents? And I have a follow-up question, but I really appreciate that answer first.
Sure, of course. So it's a YouGov sample from their kind of longstanding panel. We had 2,500 respondents, and it is a national sample. Because we're kind of doing this experimentally and stuff, we're not kind of waiting for representatives though. We're just taking the 2,500 we have that should be representative, but we're not adding weights on top of the experimental design so as not to imbalance some of the issues. And it means, right, because each respondent did 5 tasks here, we've got 12,500 choices made by respondents. And we've got, right, 25,000 profiles. So there's a lot of variation in the profiles shown to the individuals. And including, right, so I'm sure some weird ones, but, on average, we can kind of estimate the effects across that.
Okay, so yeah, because I was wondering whether the kinds of responses you'd get, so where people are located as well. You know if they're located in red state, blue state, red county, blue county areas, because I'm wondering how much looking at context might have some impact as well. A couple other comments. What strikes me is in terms of context for you putting this in, that this is it fits in nicely with the whole line of Snyderman work, and sort of another way of getting people to reveal the part that people are revealing in terms of their choices, as opposed to what they're expressing at the end about what was important, is very much in the spirit of Snyderman's survey experiments, and I think it'd be great to put it in that context. And the other positive point is that you have a lot of different ways to couch this. So it's many papers. Ron Engelhardt a few years ago, many years ago, said something that I've never been able to follow, but he did, which is if you have a good idea, you need to repeat it many times in different papers for people to get it. So I think the fact that you're getting different responses as far as how to frame it is a plus, and you should see that as an invitation to turn this into one paper for each of those contexts, rather than trying to leave it at one. But I guess the other point, it would really be fascinating to if you were able to redo this in a year, because the other big context is this was 2017. It was shortly after Trump was elected. Liberals and Democrats in particular were completely on edge, right? This was, the height of resistance. After we have a year or two of Biden's presidency, it would be really nice to see if some of that shifts. I mean, I realize that there's a long-term trends, but anyway, those are just a couple of comments for you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's all really useful, and that's something that we're kicking around, repeating this and kind of taking care of cleaning up some of the things that we've gotten some feedback on for this, and trying it again in another year or two and see if the context has changed. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in. Stephen, thanks for this talk. This is really cool. Can you go back to the early slide that was your, I think, the non-scientific graph of the difference in tasks?
Sorry, the tasks
Your
themselves, or
categorization, yeah, this one. Yes. Personal versus politically consequential. So I think I was struck by kind of maybe how little the variation mattered across the tasks. And so I want to ask kind of two related questions for you. Kind of what did you expect going into that in terms of how the tasks matter? And also, is there another dimension along which these kind of vary beyond kind of more personal versus more politically consequential? I thought of another difference, which is kind of for me as the tasker, like how much they're going to affect me as a neighbor or relative versus kind of a one-time thing, like charity or loan. Like, I don't know if that is a meaningful distinction, but something that's interesting to me. Like some of these task me with like being a part of this person's life or them being a part of my life. And others are like jury duty, okay, kind of in the middle. And then those others like, okay, just a one-time deal. So maybe that's not relevant at all. This is my thinking. I really want to know kind of what you expected in terms of those differences and maybe your speculation why those differences don't matter as much as we might have expected.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so when we were designing it, kind of the relative and neighbor items have been used in lots of various studies. And we had kind of pretty strong expectations, right, that these would matter, particularly because it's not just personal closeness, but also, as you mentioned, kind of long-standing personal closeness. Is you're not kind of, it's not a one-off interaction. And we came up with the others kind of, we were really hesitant to include kind of the charity one, is because we thought it would absolutely be massively different and kind of blow out the political effects. Because people would think that like, oh, they're going to donate to some charity that I don't support because of their views that are different than mine politically. And so we included it because we thought we were going to get massive divergence on, particularly on the political items. That is, we'd see much stronger effects in this condition for the political variables than we would for some of the personal stuff. And for these others, right, is we pulled these from a couple other people have done some other experiments with like kind of willingness to give loans, and the jury one kind of was unique to us. But effectively, kind of we expected there to be kind of a difference on this gradient, right? Is that as you get more politically consequential, that the political stuff would matter more, and arguably the more personal identities and demographic identities would matter less. But we didn't see that, and it was kind of shocking to us. And we do see little bits of variation, as mentioned, particularly for the loan task in terms of career mattering. And I don't know exactly why, right? Our first gut was like, well, maybe people just aren't reading the item underneath the table. It's just like, which of these people on the table do I like? But then it's weird that we do see some divergence in effects based on that, because our first thought was, well, people just aren't reading carefully because it's a survey and that's how they often work. But it kind of surprised us, and we still don't have a particularly good answer there. It's just that kind of, I think the judgment that people are making is pretty much just thumbs up or thumbs down in general, because they understand that that's what they're being asked to do.
I'm wondering on the loan task and the charity task, whether you have some differences in effects depending upon the wealth of the respondent, right? So $1,000 donation to a charity to some of your respondents is going to look like a huge amount, right? And to others of your respondents, it will look like, yeah, I've written checks like that. So I don't have a full theory as to how that will affect the response, but I suspect that might. And the loans similarly, depending upon the person's financial situation, whether they, what kind of position they've been in as creditor or a debtor might. But again, I don't have a theory as to how that would tie into their attribute analysis.
Thanks. No, that's really useful. We haven't looked at that to my knowledge, and something we could do so, and see if there's differences there, particularly on particularly for the loan, but also right for both the loan and charity, right, the ones involving the money, right, whether we see a divergence.
Yeah. And that's...
To go back to Davin's question, the first is, what would happen if you had people rank these tasks along your dimensions? Which ones do you believe are most politically consequential? which ones are, choices that affect you personally most. I mean, I'm curious about, like Davin, I'm curious about why we see this similar outcome. And the second is, given you find so little variability, what would produce it? Like, what task could you add in? I resolved long ago to never be the nightmare reviewer that asks for 10 more experiments that you didn't do. So I'm not. I am, though, genuinely curious. Maybe because of COVID restrictions, and I was just desperately trying to figure out when I'm ever going to play tennis or softball in a league again. I was like, what would happen if we had truly competitive tasks? Like, who would you rather be on your team, and who would you rather beat in a glorious moment of triumph, which has been long coming for me. So what would produce this, right? If they all collapse and that you can't get any traction on difference by task, how do people perceive these tasks? And in your imagining, what would produce it? My other reaction is, do you remember Twitter for a while where they would post like unexpected results from the NES, or I forget which survey, but it's like, I'm a liberal Democrat who favors progressive taxes and freedom of choice under all conditions, and I plan on voting for Trump. And it was like unexpected profiles. I mean, these factors that you have are often highly correlated, right? I don't know how many atheist Republicans people imagine there are, or I don't know what people's stereotypes of the LGBTQ community is politically, but I'm willing to bet that many people view many of these categories as synonymous, effectively, right? And they may or may not be right. And I wonder how that, you said you had a survey list experiment embedded here, and maybe that allows you to account for some of this, but I am curious about how you thought about these issues in your study.
Sure, yeah, so first on the kind of the tasks question and kind of follow up is, the marrying into a family and being a neighbor are pretty strong, right? Social kind of that person's going to be pretty close to you for a while. And so, you would imagine that would elicit some of the most kind of strong personal reactions. I think the idea of competitive tasks, as you mentioned, both like, being on a team or on a, with someone in that choice to do so, is a really interesting item. I actually haven't seen that in kind of the literature on social distance and people using it. But I don't know, how strong you would have to make this to get kind of a divergence across tasks here in terms of, you could imagine going even further than charity is like, which of these people would you rather donate to a political cause they support, or something where it's very just explicitly political in it, and whether you would see stronger effects there. We thought we were already kind of having too strong of a treatment with respect to the charity in terms of what people would infer based on that. But we could just go fully explicitly, which person would you support their political views, right? In a, or in kind of who want on a community board or something where it kind of has explicitly political implications. And let's see, on the second question, which was about, what was that? Sorry, it was the, I'm struggling to remember. You mentioned kind of the list experiment, so we didn't actually, yeah.
The high correlation across categories here.
Right. So it's a good point, and that's one of the reasons why kind of the conjoint we think is useful, is because it actually breaks the high correlation across those and allows us to estimate it. But it does mean, right, that some of these things that people are kind of used to seeing go together don't go together, and that in particular can create, right, kind of weird responses or weird things in people's minds. So one analysis we did actually kind of in response to a reviewer was look at kind of hand code, which we think are stereotypic and counter stereotypic for each party. So all the religious categories, the racial categories, and other things. It's by no means not perfect, right? But then look at kind of the number of consistent rows in a task that a person got to see how consistent with party you get there, and see whether that kind of creates a stronger kind of partisan effect, because people may realize kind of what goes with what and make inferences there. And it is true, you do see kind of that when you have these violations of expectations, so an atheist Republican or an LGBT Republican, or kind of an evangelical Democrat, or these kind of things counter to type, you do see a little bit of a reduction in the effects of partisanship in these politically salient variables as well. It gets a little messy just because some of these are, we can kind of binarily code it as against or type or with type. And, in the real breakdown in society, it's like 60-40 or something. And so it's not perfect, and some are stronger signals. But it's a good question, because while it's a kind of a virtue of the design, it's a problem for the kind of broader, external validity.
In a future study, it could be fascinating to have buttons for them to reveal whether they got the information. So you could track which of the 12 things, ideology, religion, people clicked prior to making the determination, and then have a timer on lag time exposed, like how long they spent studying it, since you talk about satisficing and try to figure out how people are going to go making your choice.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really, as an aside, I've seen a few kind of working papers in their infancy of, you have to do it kind of more in a lab, but people using eye trackers with conjoints, just to actually see where people are going with the bits of information, and how that might diverge from what they say they're using in the choice as well.
So I was wondering, Stephen, if you had thought of, and if you rejected why, including as traits some explicit political choices, like people's attitudes on climate change, or whatever you have information on in the YouGov panel, so that you could match it up to the respondents' preferences. But some explicit political choices. What's the reason for not doing that, or consider that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's kind of, the short answer is that we kind of just didn't want to be too overtly political alongside all these other kind of core demographic things that you would think are more important in kind of apolitical contexts. But it's something I think we would probably do in future iterations, whether kind of things that you might reasonably find out about a person in a basic kind of social setting. So their views on an issue, like you mentioned, climate change or something else, could work. We did pre-test some of the items here, and in fact, one of the things that got cut in the pretest was we had and I think Graham mentioned this earlier, but just like for the jury task, having someone who, have a personality trait of being fair or all these other things, is we had a row in the table that was like a personality trait, right? Kind of the core personality trait for this person or whatever. We had I believe we had fairness, we had compassion, we had like leadership, we had integrity, we had a few others, some of the more Republican and Democratic associated items. And we trimmed it because we didn't really see much. That we don't know why. I think maybe a lot of people just viewed it as cheap talk, right? As anybody can call themselves anything, and doesn't necessarily mean that defines that person. And they're much more willing to rely on kind of these more immutable categories.
Danielle?
Yeah, I'll ask another question. So sometimes with smaller talks like this, it can be helpful to sort through or to talk about things that you're still, things that would be helpful from your angle. Is there anything that you would like feedback on, or that you, there are a couple different ways that you're still considering and that you'd like to kind of crowdsource those ways, or not?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one thing we, in the current iteration of the paper, have been struggling with is how much to kind of emphasize the results surrounding, let me just scroll through, the interaction between partisanship and ideology, because that's one of the most interesting to us. And to the point where framing this as the way the paper is currently constructed, it's here's the core results of the experiment, and that's tacked on. And it feels like almost it could be either a separate paper or something that is interesting there, particularly because I didn't show it, but we have across the strength of partisanship here. So there's a lot of data points because, but for all kind of the typical 7 partisan identification categories, and the cell sizes do get small here, but you can see a number of kind of pretty interesting things about the heterogeneity across the strength of partisanship mattering, both at the respondents as well as kind of what's signaled as the strength of partisanship for the respondents. Right, so for like the Democrats judging the Republicans, is you get almost kind of a perfect gradient in terms of partisan strength, with the kind of not so strong Republicans slightly kind of behind the lean Republicans, which is actually kind of a known thing, but we don't see it on this side. The independents are kind of all around the place, kind of given the context, leaning Democratic, right, being most positive. But it's a little bit surprising that we don't see kind of the massive negativity, is that when you obviously lump across these, this becomes statistically significant for Republicans being negative about Democrats. But individually, each of the kind of the Republican categories is not massively different than one another when thinking about a Democrat. Whereas for Democrats, we actually see, right, the most boosting for Democrats, right, are the ones that call them independents first and themselves independents first, and then follow up with that. So I guess the thing I would just pose is that, like, you know, we don't have a perfectly kind of compelling theoretical story about the interaction of partisanship and ideology here, but it seems to be an interesting area we could focus in. And I don't know if there's like some kind of signal in the noise that you see that could tie this stuff together.
You could also connect this to the Grossman and Hopkins work on Republicans and Democrats having a different structure, preference structure. So I thought that also kind of seemed, I'm really interested like in what you showed in the talk, that fourth cut, the party ideology, but it did feel a little like not totally connected. So if you wanted to cut those into, like what Carol was saying, do different papers, that coupled with this would be a nice paper. And then the lack of variation across those tasks could be a tighter paper as well. Just as,
right,
you know, some thoughts. But this 1 to 7 gradient here is pretty fascinating. I mean, that's wild.
Right. It's weird how perfect it is for rating Republicans. Right. And then how imperfect it is for rating Democrats. And again, I don't know if this is partly the story that kind of has been mentioned a few times in different places, right? Of, is this a function of it being 2017 in terms of the kind of positivity or negativity towards the two parties?
Could you put up again the table that you had that I didn't find in the paper on what people said was the most important factor? That
Sure.
was yeah, that one there, right. So did you try splitting that out by party to see whether Democrats and Republicans differ in terms of what they expressed as their most important factor? I mean, because given what you just showed in answer to Danielle, I would imagine that you might find some differences there as well. But
right, we have. I don't have it, and I don't think in the appendix in the paper or in these slides. We have, in particular, we looked really closely in at because we have a pretty large size sample of people that said none was most important. So are these people the people that are actually, like, they're saying none because they actually want to discriminate or are discriminating on some of the factors that are less socially desirable to do so. And we do see a little bit of a difference in effects there, not massive though. And right, is that kind of the people that say none here have slightly larger effect sizes for things like race and sex and some of the categories that they maybe don't want to admit to using. But it's not a super clear picture across the tasks. And I don't think we've broken it out by partisanship across all of these, but that's something we could do.
But I was thinking particularly for party, so distinguishing people who are self-identified strong partisans versus people who, you know, the naive hypothesis would be people who are strong partisans by self-identification would be more likely to say that party is something that factored into their classification. So if you don't find that would be interesting also. And anyway, that one would be a fairly strong prediction I would make.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Thank you.
except for loans.
I've pasted in Stephen's site address where you can find his contact information. If you have follow-up questions for Professor Goggin, you can direct them there. What I'm going to do now is, as would often happen, where we actually on the 5th floor and actually in the Partisan room and actually waiting for everyone else to leave so I could grab an extra sandwich, is allow people to trickle out of the room, but continue the conversation. So for those of you who need to go, that's great. For those of you who have a few extra things they want to say that maybe they're reluctant to in a more formal context, by all means, feel free to linger. We'll keep this room open for a little while longer. Thank you so much for that talk. It was really excellent.